Hey everybody, it's Dicebag, and today I just want to go on a bit of a rant and talk about the state of a game that's near and dear to me. That game would be Pokemon. Now, if you haven't heard, the next generation of games is coming out later this year, and Game Freak has enraged the world by saying that they will not be including all of the previous Pokemon in these games. And by that, they mean they can't even be transferred into the game from other sources. Of course, they've come out and made excuses about why they've chosen to do this, but frankly, none of it really holds water, so I think it's an appropriate time for me to come out and tear them a new one over this. But not just this. They've been mishandling the franchise for a few years now, and I think there's a core problem that we can point to with all these mishaps. I'll get into that later on. Now, first of all, let's talk about the excuses. One of the things they mentioned was that they were recreating all the Pokemon models from scratch, so they wouldn't have enough time to model and animate all 8 or 900 of them for the game. And to that I say, poppycock. Bullcrap. This supposed problem is entirely self-inflicted. Like Game Freak. Do you really believe that people play Pokemon for the graphics? Not a single person on the planet has ever said, "Oh, I like the Pokemon games because they got such good graphics." Nobody has said that, ever. But Pokemon is still one of the best-selling game franchises anyway. Remodeling every single Pokemon is completely unnecessary. The franchise could persist indefinitely on the same level of graphics that Gen 7 had, easily. Just look at the direction games have been going over the past decade. More and more games are opting to go with older graphical styles, or they're heavily stylizing the art for their games. Only the big AAA studios are continuing with this trend of increasing realism, and look where it's getting them. Nowhere. They constantly complain that the cost of creating these games keeps their profits down, and now their sales are starting to dry up too. The engine you were using was already a perfect match for Pokemon's cartoony art style. Why would you change it if that means you have to cut out a major feature of the franchise? The trade-off is obviously not worth it. Now for the next excuse they make. They also made the claim that leaving out Pokemon will let them diversify the metagame and give new Pokemon a chance to shine, and that's also a load of crap. New Pokemon have always had a chance to shine. The entire game gave them a chance to shine. It's only in the post-game that they ever got overshadowed. Just look back to Gen 5, Black and White. It had a national dex and you could transfer old Pokemon over to it. But the main part of the game had a completely new roster of Pokemon. Not a single old Pokemon appeared in Black and White until you made it to the post-game. If you're so worried about the new monsters being overshadowed by old ones, then simply do that again. And as far as metagame diversity is concerned, I assume they're talking about the competitive scene. Well, that's also very easy to fix. Make different formats. That's it. That's all you gotta do. Make a format that allows legendaries, one that bans them. Make a format for each generation. You could have formats that specifically mimic the metagames of previous generations. And it's not like this is unprecedented. Card games have been doing this since the genre was created. Get out of your box, Game Freak. Besides all that, there's one more thing in particular that really set me off. Not long ago, I watched a video from a YouTuber called Sylph Spectre, and in this video he dug up an interview from a while back with a lesser-known employee of Game Freak. In this interview, the guy said that the studio's A-team has been busy working on one of their big side game projects, so the next generation of Pokemon was being handled by their B-team. Why? Because the A-team was getting burned out on Pokemon. How can you be burned out on Pokemon? You've barely even scratched the surface on a lot of concepts that you brought in generations ago. The design space for Pokemon is like a freaking jungle. It's completely unexplored. That really got me thinking, and I have to come to the conclusion that Game Freak has no understanding of what their own game actually is. These idiots are over there trying to make some new story-driven JRPG every generation. That is not what Pokemon is. So what is Pokemon exactly? Well, let me boil it down to its base elements. Pokemon is a game where you collect different types of game pieces, then assemble a limited number of them into a group and use that group to play head-to-head matches against other players, or AIs. It's a digital card game, basically. It just so happens to have a single-player campaign with an overworld that vaguely resembles a JRPG. That's where the disconnect really resides. Game Freak is so focused on making the campaign mode that they've totally neglected to explore the core mechanics of the actual game, the combat system. What, you're telling me they can't come up with a better mechanic than poor man's Mega Evolution? There's a ton of design space in the combat system that hasn't been explored, and they just opened up more of it in the last 2 generations. Just look at regional forms. There's so much variety they could add on to pre-existing Pokemon with that mechanic, but they've dropped it completely. The same goes for Mega Evolution, which lets them play around with different stats and abilities on a single Pokemon, all at the cost of a held item. And what about all the one-shot mechanics they've done in the past? Flying Press comes to mind. You remember that one? The only dual-type move in the whole game? Why is it the only one? You could expand on the regional form idea too. What about hybrid forms? Some Pokemon could change their typing based on having a certain parent. It would make breeding a lot more interesting for people who aren't big on competitive play. How about changing up the resource management? It's not like the PP system is anything special. Why not make more moves that interact with stockpiles? How about introducing a new status effect? The design space is there, and it's pretty abundant. Game Freak needs a big change in perspective if they have a hard time coming up with new material for Pokemon. But the really sad thing is that the Pokemon Company has started tapping into the mobile market more and more since Pokemon Go came around. And frankly, that's where they should be drawing inspiration from. The main series of Pokemon games would benefit hugely by adopting some of the strategies for new content that mobile games use. And let's face it, Pokemon is long overdue on embracing things like expansion packs and DLC. It was understandable when they were a handheld-only franchise, but that ship has sailed. Sword and Shield are on the main console now. If they were serious about making the game last, they wouldn't be coming out with new standalone games anymore. They'd be making a single, monolithic Pokemon game that they can update with new regions, new Pokemon, new storylines, and all that good stuff. In other words, they'd treat it more like an MMO. The fact is, Game Freak desperately needs to modernize their business model for Pokemon. But rather than doubling down on the things that has made the franchise successful in the first place and enhancing those, they've chosen to turn things in a different direction, a direction that's quite opposite from where they've been going. Now let me give you a little recent history lesson on something that mirrors this almost exactly. New Coke. You see, back in the 80s, Coca-Cola was getting beat up by Pepsi. In an effort to combat this, they completely revamped the formula for Coke. They made the taste much sweeter, more like Pepsi in other words. The problem was this: Coke drinkers didn't want a drink that tasted like Pepsi, and Pepsi drinkers already had Pepsi to drink. New Coke flopped, and within 3 months, Coca-Cola announced it would be bringing back the original formula as Coca-Cola Classic. The lesson that Game Freak and many other game companies need to take away from that story is this: don't try to turn your product into something it's not. If you go off chasing trends at the expense of traditionally core features, then you're going to find yourself behind on the trends, while your core fans are left in the dust and feeling betrayed. You can't just continually inflate your fan base because at some point it's going to pop. You have to build that base brick by brick if you want it to last.